Australia is the greatest nation on earth, and at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. G'day Tony, and hello to all of our listeners. Great to be back for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. Today we'll be discussing the tragedy that took place in Bondi, the stabbing of a bishop in Western Sydney, as well as the escalation of tensions in the Middle East, plus what Tony has been doing overseas, most recently in Canada. Tony, great to be back with you.
Dan, wonderful to be with you and our listeners.
Great. Tony, let's start with the tragedy that was the stabbings in Bondi, a number of people killed, also acts of heroism that took place, whether it was the so-called Bollard man who sought to stop the perpetrator, the police woman who shot him, but clearly a devastating situation for the community, Tony.
Absolutely right, Dan. To think that people just going about their normal business on a Saturday afternoon in a very pleasant shopping centre, many of us have been to it, to think that all of a sudden they would be randomly struck down by a lunatic with a knife. I guess the tragedy of this particular individual is that he had mental health problems. He was obviously someone who had had trouble connecting. He was lost, like so many people are today, without a purpose, without a sense of hope, without a feeling of community. And this is what he did. Thank God most people in that situation don't react with this kind of horrific violence. But it is a sign of some of the soul problems, S-O-U-L problems, that our modern, somewhat faithless society has. And obviously our hearts bleed for the victims and their families and their loved ones. But, as you say, if there can be an upside to something as horrible as this, it was the fact that so many normal, everyday Australians responded with vigour and courage and decency to a horrible situation. I mean, we sometimes doubt how people will respond in a crisis, and quite a few people stepped up in the crisis that they found themselves most unexpectedly in on Saturday afternoon. So while it is a lamentable business, I guess there is a little silver lining to that particular cloud, and let's be full of praise for all of the people who rose to the occasion.
Yeah, indeed, Tony. And then only a couple of days later, we had the stabbing of a Christian bishop in his own church in southwest Sydney while he was delivering a sermon. Now, this has been declared an act of terror. It was what appears to be pretty clearly religiously motivated on behalf of the perpetrator. I think a lot of Australians are on tenterhooks at the moment, wondering what is going on. Now, these are unrelated, is important to say. They're unfortunate coincidences, if you like. But Tony, just interested to get your thoughts at a headline level before we delve into it about what happened in southwest Sydney.
Well, we've all seen the footage because it's been on social media and it's been broadcast by just about every mainstream channel. This individual plainly was trying to stab the bishop around the head and neck. Thank God he doesn't appear to have done serious damage. Then, of course, he was rushed by the parishioners, good on them. And it seems that he was saying in Arabic that he was only doing it because the bishop had allegedly insulted the prophet. Now, I've watched some of Bishop Emmanuel's sermons since this incident, and far from being some kind of hate preacher, he's obviously a man of strong views. He's obviously a man of deep faith, but he's also someone who wants to reach out to others in a spirit of love and compassion. He's the absolute polar opposite of the hate preachers that we've also seen online and in the media, who are spewing bile against Jewish people and against all infidels, and talking about killing Jews and driving infidels out. So look, we can but hope for a swift recovery from his injuries, and would like to see him back in his pulpit as soon as possible, and would like to see his congregation reassured that here in this country we have a zero tolerance policy for violence of all types, and we have a zero tolerance policy for hate speech of all types. And I really would like to see a much more vigorous response from the New South Wales police, and indeed police right around Australia, against other forms of hate, such as the hate that we have seen routinely on our streets from these pro-Hamas river to the sea demonstrators. I mean, let's be absolutely crystal clear. The October the 7th atrocity did not spark, as it should have, a strong sense of solidarity with the Jewish people and support for the only liberal democracy in the Middle East amongst a significant element of Australians. It's prompted a wave of nasty anti-Semitism and what is effectively support for an apocalyptic terrorist organisation. The most obvious example of that is the just disgusting chants, which I won't even repeat, outside the Opera House on October the 9th, before there'd been any Israeli response to the Hamas atrocity.
Well, Tony, just building on that, so Cameron Milner has written, I think, a very good article today in The Australian. He was Bill Shorten's chief of staff. He now runs his own consulting firm. And I've got to say, he's been one of the leading voices on the Labor side ever since the attacks, in calling out what has been, I think, pretty pathetic leadership or lack of leadership from the federal government. It's a couple of critical points that Cameron makes. The first, he says, is we need our political leadership to have an open and honest conversation about Islamic extremism in the country. He also says, importantly here, Tony, that there's obviously a political element for Labor, which is that Labor appears to be compromised. Labor has been trying to avoid offending Muslim voters and forcing an exodus to the Greens or independents. In doing this, however, it has offended the Jewish community and the rest of us who value democracy and the rule of law. So just starting with the broader issue of certain elements of the Islamic community, is this something that you think can be resolved in terms of elements of the Islamic leadership calming the more extreme elements, or do we now have a fundamental problem with multiculturalism in this country? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a big subject, Dan, and I'm not sure that we can do justice to it in just a few minutes. But look, it is hard to avoid the suspicion that some senior members of the current government are responding more to ethnic pressures inside their electorates than they are considering the long-term Australian national interest and upholding long-term Australian values. I know Tony Burke pretty well. He's in many respects a capable individual, but his response to the October 7 atrocity was pretty ambivalent, to put it mildly. And I guess the fact that he's got something like 25% Muslim vote in his electorate may have influenced him. Now, I want to make 2 points. As Edmund Burke said to the electors of Bristol, I owe you my judgment, not obedience. I owe you judgment, not obedience. And it's the job of a Member of Parliament not simply to do what his electors want. It's the job of a Member of Parliament to do what his electors need. And what's needful here is a response that's in Australia's national interests, not in Palestine's national interest, in Australia's national interests. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that, look, it's very understandable that immigrants from a particular place who still have family back there will feel deeply concerned on a humanitarian basis for what's happening. But when people come to Australia, they aren't just changing their address, they're embracing a way of life, a new civic identity, if you like. And a part of our civic identity is support for democracy, it's support for human rights, it's an appreciation of our history, it's an understanding of the positions that Australia typically takes on global issues, and the idea that an Australian could be on the side of an apocalyptic death cult, namely Hamas, as opposed to a liberal democracy like Israel, where people of all faiths and none are represented in the Israeli parliament, where people of all sorts of diverse lifestyles are given freedom and a fair go inside Israel, and contrast that with the sorts of things that happen inside Gaza or indeed on the West Bank, where particular lifestyles are met with persecution and often with death. So yes, by all means, bleed for the civilian casualties of Israel's just war against Hamas, but you can't be on Hamas's side, not if you have properly integrated into the Australian community.
Well, I think the problem we've got, Tony, is there are a number of people who are on Hamas's side and who are citizens of Australia. And I don't understand how that's been allowed to happen. There's clearly a dramatic failure of leadership to have proper integration into our values, that we have citizens who hold these views.
And I think that's a fair point. I am proud of the multi-ethnic nature of modern Australia, and I appreciate that people coming to this country come with a background, and I've always interpreted the right kind of multiculturalism, if you like, as simply saying to newcomers, you can integrate and ultimately assimilate in your own way and at your own pace. We're not going to be applying any hard and fast tests of Australianness to you anytime soon. But certainly supporting an apocalyptic death cult as opposed to a liberal democracy under existential threat, I don't think passes any reasonable Australianness test. And I hope anyone who is feeling at the moment that they would want Hamas to beat the Israeli military should ask themselves, are they being logical or are they simply being emotional? And in a situation like this, I can understand emotion because, hey, we all feel it. But in the end, you've got to temper your emotions with judgment. You've got to, in a sense, discipline your emotions. And just as some of the angry people outside the bishop's church should have disciplined their emotions with judgment, I certainly think anyone marching for Hamas should be better disciplining their emotions with judgment.
I'm going to ask you a question that's quite difficult in a way. I don't know whether it can be resolved, but what do you think we do with the people that are here that don't want to reform, who don't see a problem with saying the things that they've been saying and actually genuinely believe those things and who are citizens? Is there a way that this can be resolved in a sort of measured, non-hostile manner? What can leaders do to try and resolve this?
I think we just have to try harder. Excuse me. I think we just have to work harder to persuade people that the better perspective on all of this is to support humane, liberal, democratic values And whatever mistakes the Israeli government might from time to time make, and obviously a terrible mistake was made when those aid workers were hit by Israeli missiles, whatever mistakes the Israeli government might make, in the end, they are operating under the same sorts of values that we operate under here in Australia. And please consider just what sort of societies different sets of values produce. Look at the sort of society that Hamas values produce. Look at the sort of society that Australian values produce. The fact that you're here in Australia suggests that in the end you appreciate that our values are best. Live by them.
Just one more on this, Tony, and we'll move on. So Greg Sheridan writes, the foreign editor of The Australian, writes about the historical, conflict between Islam and those of the Assyrian Christian beliefs, going back, the Assyrian
hundreds of years.
Assyrian genocide in 1915, but much earlier than that as well. I think a lot of Australians sort of go, well, that's interesting, but why are we in a situation where we're effectively importing a lot of the world's historical sectarian conflict? And I think it concerns people that if you look around the outer suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, you've essentially got fairly embedded ethnic enclaves who through digital media and social media now don't really need to integrate. They don't need to speak English. They read the news from their homeland and there's a variety of issues there. Is multiculturalism now dead in this country? How do we sort of reconcile these issues where the integration's not happening as it used to? What does this mean?
Well, I've always distinguished between a kind of hard multiculturalism, which encouraged people to basically be foreigners living in Australia, from what might be described as a genial multiculturalism, which is, look, if you come to Australia from a very different society, obviously it's going to take you some time, maybe a couple of generations to fully assimilate, and we're not intending to put too much pressure on you. As I said, we're not going to make you conform to any dramatic Australianness test. So I think the important thing is to remember that we expect migrants to join Team Australia, not live in Hotel Australia. I think that's the important thing. Now, I'm not saying that we should suddenly have a cultural test to our migration policy. Frankly, the best way to have people integrated swiftly into our society is to ensure that people who are coming here have a job from day one, doing something useful from day one, mixing with their fellow Australians from day one. That's the best way of running an immigration policy that will ensure that over time our country benefits and all of its citizens go forward together. That's what we should do. And again, if you contrast the general official approach of the 1950s and the 1960s with what is often the official approach today, then we were told that Australia was the best country in the world. You're damned lucky to be here, and we expect you to make the most of it and to become like us as soon as you can. Now, we're often told that Australia is vaguely illegitimate because we displaced the original inhabitants and so on. We are, in many respects, a racist country, and no, don't be too much like us because, hey, why would you be, given the flawed character of modern Western societies? And I just think we've got to go right away from that. Maybe we can be a little less triumphalist than we were in the 1950s and 60s, but hey, by any reasonable standard, by any objective test, this is a wonderful country. The vast majority of migrants come here because they want to join us, not because they want to change us, and we should be absolutely encouraging that instinct that they all come here with, to be as Australian as you can be, as quickly as you can be, And please, to the extent that you humanly can, leave your problems at the door.
Well, on that note, Tony, we might move from the domestic to the international, still on the topic of the Middle East nonetheless, which is the attacks on Israel having been escalated over the weekend by Iran. It was the first ever direct attack on Israel coming out of Tehran. Something like 300 missiles was sent at Israel. Now, that was mostly foiled by the dome, the defensive dome that Israel has set up over many years, but this does seem to mark an escalation of conflict. Israel has said that there will be some kind of response, that quite reasonably Iran won't get off scot-free, because you can imagine the incentives that would set up. But Tony, this seems to be a concerning escalation, and this is something that you've been pointing to for a long time now, which is that if we don't get in control of this is going to metastasize, and that looks like what might be happening.
Yes, there does appear to be very significant potential for escalation, but I'm not going to be publicly telling Israel that take it on the cheek. I think that there's a world of difference between what the gospel might advise people they should do in order to be more perfect Christians, and what a national government should do when its people have come under deadly assault, even if in this case the assault has turned out to be relatively ineffective. Look, if the Israelis think that it is in their best interest to hit back hard at Iran, I'm certainly not going to be critical of them. Obviously, unlike the Iranian missiles, which were almost entirely indiscriminate, any Israeli response would have to be a discriminate one aimed at military targets. But I would imagine from everything I know of the Israelis that would be A, their intention, and B, their capability.
Yeah, that's right, Tony. And I think the other issue here is, as it relates to the so-called international community's view of Israel, I think has been less than supportive as compared with previous situations. How do you sort of see that playing out on the broader sort of international relations side of it?
Well, I was very encouraged that when the Iranian barrage was launched, it wasn't just knocked down by Israel's anti-missile systems and the Israeli Defence Force. There was very considerable assistance coming from the United States, from Britain, and also, interestingly, from Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The fact that the strongest Western powers were there to assist Israel in its moment of need, the fact that decent Middle Eastern countries, and I've got a lot of respect for the Jordanian people and the Jordanian government, the fact that Israel turned out to have more friends than you might have thought, I think is one hopeful sign in what is otherwise a fairly dark time.
And just staying with the international front in a way, Tony, to finish off our discussion now, over the last sort of couple of years, you've been providing a lot of leadership on the international front with your engagements overseas, whether in Hungary or the US or most recently in Canada. And I think as time goes by, the successes of your government have been looked at from abroad, in the United Kingdom, stopping the boats, in Canada, axing the tax. I think the opposition leader in Canada has sort of taken your 2010, 2013 playbook and adopted it as his own, which is certainly, I think, a very fitting. Can you tell us what you're doing in Canada and give us a bit of an assessment of the domestic political situation there?
Well, thanks, Dan. Look, I essentially did three things. I gave a talk to something called the Aristotle Foundation in Calgary. I gave a presentation to the Macdonald Laurier Institute in Toronto, which is a Canadian think tank, and I then addressed the Canada Strong and Free group, which is, if you like, a fairly vigorous centre-right kind of activist body. And amongst other things, I was able to spend a fair bit of time with Canadian Conservative members of Parliament, including the opposition leader, who is a very impressive individual, and if the polls are right, is likely to be the next Canadian Prime Minister. But it was interesting. The mantra, Pierre Poilievre's mantra is axe the tax, build the homes, stop the crime, and fix the budget, which is highly reminiscent.
I've heard that before.
Highly reminiscent of the mantra that I took to the 2013 election. And look, if you are going to successfully persuade the public to vote for you, they've got to know how the country will be different and better under a new government. And that's exactly what Pierre Poilievre is doing right now. He's saying, look, it'll be different in this respect. I'll axe the tax, I'll build the homes, I'll stop the crime, and I'll fix the budget. And good on him, because just as that was very necessary in Australia back in 2013, it seems to be very necessary in Canada right now.
And what was the feeling like on the ground in Canada? Was there a sense that Trudeau is on his way out? Is there frustration in sort of the local community with the direction of the government? Did you get an opportunity to sort of get a feel for that?
Well, Dan, look, it was a lightning visit, and I was mostly attending conferences as opposed to fraternising with people in the street. My sense of ordinary Canadians is that, very much like ordinary Australians, they go about their business largely oblivious to politics, and that Canada is a pretty good country, as Australia is. Sometimes, though, great countries like ours are held back by bad governments or governments that could be so much better, and I suspect that's the case in Canada now. Certainly it was very much the case with the centre-right activists that I was with. They think that it's time for a change of government, and they are determined that the next Conservative government in Canada will be a real Conservative government, that it will be a real alternative, not just a weak echo of a bad Green Left government.
Well, Tony, thanks very much for the time. I know you just got off the plane last night or the night before, and you're off again next week. So I appreciate you finding the time to talk with us, and we'll chat again in a couple of weeks.
Dan, few things give me more satisfaction than these conversations, and thank you for continuing them.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.